It's quite amazing that all the science fiction books and movies that go along these very dystopian paths have almost been kind of co-opted by some of these Silicon Valley tech bros who have kind of missed the whole point of these films, which is don't do this. It's very bad.
Welcome to TalkBack, Back Market's new podcast. My name is Vianney. I'm the co-founder of Back Market, and I have the privilege to be your host. The topic of this episode is something that seems to be on every lips today: artificial intelligence. The thing is, it's now genuinely difficult to have a fresh conversation about AI because so much has been said already, and the landscape is shifting so rapidly that what you're saying today can be outdated tomorrow. The noise is everywhere, and the clarity is quite hard to find. So if you're going to discuss this properly, you need a very, very good guest, someone with strong original views on the matter, and someone who has the capacity to see clearly through the blurring and the fuzziness. I couldn't think of a better guest than Gaia Vince. Gaia is a science writer and author who spent most of her career observing and theorizing the impact of technology, communication, climate change has on our very own humanity. And I met her earlier at a roundtable organized by Back Market. I was immediately struck by her, passion on the topic of AI and her ability to put it in perspective, connecting this technological revolution to structural phenomena dating back thousands of years. Gaia put the whole roundtable on fire almost literally that night, and I'm sure she'll do the same for this conversation we're going to have, trying to answer together the very broad and loaded questions of the true hidden costs of AI. Gaia, it's a pleasure to have you.
Such a pleasure, Vianney.
And since I know you're not you're not planning to be necessarily very tender to technology over the next 45 minutes or so, I'd like to start with just a bit of love. If you had to declare your flame to a certain version of AI, which one would it be? Which kind of AI would you actually love to see happen?
Okay, so I mean, AI is a tool, and what it's very, very good at is going through enormous data sets, which for humans is a really laborious, time-consuming task that could take thousands upon thousands of hours for thousands of laborers. So jobs like meteorological data, which help with predicting weather patterns, that kind of thing, it's really good at. Finding new drug combinations, could be really good at that sort of thing. I mean, I use it for things like correcting spelling, search engines, that kind of thing. AI is really good for. But what it is increasingly being touted as a great use for is a replacement for human creativity. And that's really dangerous, I think, for lots and lots of reasons. And we need to ask questions about what do we actually want from our AI? Do we want it to replace the joys that we find in life, the meaning of life, the meaning of work, the creative aspects, which actually it is very, very poor at? Or do we want it to replace those menial tasks that are just drudgery and soul sapping, things like going through huge data sets, and that's, I think, where we really need to think.
I think it's interesting because to ask those questions and find answers, you also need like time and space, and things are moving insanely fast. As a researcher, I was curious to hear from you. How do you manage to, think and build like long-lasting theories and such a fast-moving object? And what's the general direction that you're currently exploring?
Yeah, I mean, it is moving incredibly, incredibly quickly. And we need to ask questions about, who owns these models, who writes the rules, the code, because those codes are quite autocratic. And if they are in the hands of just a few individuals, that's very, very undemocratic. And the speed that it's going is very undemocratic. Who gets to profit from this? Whose jobs are on the line? Who gets to benefit from any of this? It's very, very opaque. We don't get a look into these algorithms, into the choices they're making. A lot of it is based on surveillance. Right. So it's either based on human surveillance or it's based on stealing creative works, stealing our works to essentially replace us. I mean, a lot of human jobs at the moment are essentially either training, they're the drudgery of training and correcting these AI algorithms. That is a very boring, repetitive task, and those people will be replaced. So essentially, they're working to replace these algorithms, and a lot of those jobs are taking place in poor countries where people are essentially in these big warehouses with very poor conditions. It's very hot. They don't have enough breaks and water. So there are huge issues, and that's not even talking about data centers. There's huge issues around all of this, and it's moving so fast that we haven't democratically decided, we haven't collectively made a decision about how these tools are being used. And if we look, take a step back and look through the kind of long lens of history about when new technologies came in to replace what was taking, what was the current labor model or whatever was going on. I mean, we have the Industrial Revolution, for example. Now, that made a few people very, very wealthy. And collectively, over a long period of time, it did raise living standards. I mean, obviously, it came with pollution. But at the time, it also led to enormous amounts of drudgery. So people who were skilled weavers, craftspeople, their jobs were replaced by machinery. And they were just basically correcting the machines, feeding the machines. And there was a lot of child labor involved. It was very poor working conditions. And we're sort of starting to see that model being replaced in our democratic society. So we really need to think about, are we making a choice, or are governments essentially being coerced by the capitalist marketplace of a lot of hedge funds and VC investments going into this AI bubble, in order to justify increased investment. And we as societies, as democratic societies, shouldn't be upholding this very small individual's enormous amount of wealth, a wealth creation. We need to step back from that.
You mentioned the Industrial Revolution and the ability as a society to overcome, maybe hiccup is not necessarily the best word to describe, the iniquities that came from it. But after that, as you mentioned, we managed to build middle class and raise living standards for billions of people, actually. I'm curious to know, what does your gut tell you? Do you think our institutions, our governments, social instances will be able to overcome the unbalance that are currently at work, provoked by AI? Or do you think it's doomsday and the world as we know it is basically collapsing on our very own eyes?
I think that's a very, very dangerous path to walk down, this idea that there is an inevitability to any of this. That is the idea which is actually being promoted by the owners of this AI. And the owners are essentially saying everything is terrible, you have to have this, and this is just the way it's going to be. The European AI Institute, I think only today, said that we need to make a choice between either doing net zero or AI, and the implication being that we need gas and fossil fuel powered AI stations, and that is more important than our net zero contributions. Actually, no, right? Biology is better than bits, right? Biology should win out. Choose life. Choose life always. So, if we want a livable future, that is the perspective and the angle through which we should view everything. Is AI going to enhance our lives? How do we make sure it does? And that is a policymaker's choice, but it is also the choice of citizens to stand up and say, no, we will decide how those tools, we will not be dictated. We will not say that it is inevitable that the world is going to fire and that inequity is inevitable and we should just live with it. And eventually it might be worked out through the great benefits of AI. No, we choose to put equity first. We choose to put a livable planet first. And then we assess tools like AI all the tools that we have at our disposal, how we create our energy, how we use the material choices, every single choice should be looked at through the lens of livability, right? And through the lens that we agree as citizens to live under, through equity, through a prospering economy that enables jobs to be meaningful and provide lifestyles that people feel that they're progressing and that they have opportunities. And if we just accept that there is no alternative, well, they've already won, okay? And that's really bad. That really makes me worry.
I'm with you. I think it's a fascinating time where like we are objectively living a revolution, like literally happening under our fingertips, and the pace of change is like so rapid. It's like I've never seen something like that, like in my professional life. And the dominant emotional register though is like kind of like a sense of fatalism, right? Like this is happening, but there is nothing we can do about it. Like the machines are taking over, and this is just how it goes. When this is a very moment where things should be negotiated. Like what's the framework, what's the architecture, who owns what, and what are the impacts in the long run?
Vianney, you know what it reminds me of?
Yeah.
It reminds me of the fossil fuel arguments during the beginnings of the climate crisis, when it was like, oh, the temperature's going to go up anyway, it's fine. What we'll do is we'll just we'll build machines to suck the carbon out, and that will solve the problem. But there is no alternative, really. There's no plausible alternative to fossil fuels. Otherwise, your economies will crash. You have to do this. Right? It's the same argument that there isn't an alternative, whereas we know now, actually, there is an alternative. Renewables are they're outperforming fossil fuels in numerous ways. And we need to look at this technology, what's going on at the moment. And, the things that really worry me is a lot of this data scraping that's going on. A lot of the AI companies are convincing governments that they need this for their health systems, for their security systems, for their military, all of that. And we are getting surveillance and data that is very personal, that is publicly owned, and we gave to our governments in trust, right? From our national health services, from our school systems, from our voting and our our pensions and all of that, taxes, all of that data is in trust, right? We've given that in trust for the government, for our society to run. And if the AI has that, if the AI, whoever controls that AI, basically that surveillance system has the ability to do all kinds of autocratic things. And we see in China, for example, which is very far ahead in the surveillance state, that it's very similar to the Stasi, but much, much more powerful, right? This is enormously powerful. I think we need to make some very strong choices now, and we either go down the much more trusting route and keep that public trust in government, or we say we don't care. It can go. It can be owned by private enterprise.
I think probably people do care, but like this resistance you're mentioning is not maybe shaping up as fast or as strong as it would need to happen. I feel like the traditional actors of resistance, like political parties or like artists even, are probably in half state of consideration, like what's happening to us, and half like trying to find maybe a compromise between like kind of like a de facto AI revolution and like what it is going to do to democracies, to arts and stuff like that. I wonder, like through your research and observation today, like who's the most likely to lead the resistance? Like do you see like where is it shaping up, like what's triggering it, and who's carrying the flag, the flag of the anti-AI, or like not anti-AI necessarily, but like good AI vision and revolution?
Yeah, I mean, there are some extraordinary, everybody from academics to community groups to, a few leaders who are starting to at least make questions about some of these things. At the moment, it is being thrust and forced on us in a very undemocratic way. If you buy any device, it is likely, or use any computer program, it's likely to now have AI on it. And that's very frustrating. And so people are starting to fight back. There is a lot of resistance against, for example, data center expansion, particularly in the United States. And that's for, well-documented environmental reasons, for health reasons. And, it's also a pushback against the undemocratic nature of this, because when something big is built that uses a lot of public resources like water, like energy, creates a lot of heat, is an imposition in your local environment, you want to know that there is a net benefit, not even necessarily to you, but to society generally. And when they can't offer that in a very obvious way, then you have a problem. And I think that resistance is building. I think it's been very, very slow and late coming. And I think it's, we are seeing, for example, we're seeing stars and, Hollywood stars, singers, celebrities fighting back against, AI manipulation of their public persona, right? So we have politicians that have been, there are AI pornographic videos of them on social media. That's an absolute disgrace. And there is a huge streak of misogyny, of racism, of all kinds of discrimination running through these models. And whether that's the algorithms that are, again, as I said, they're very opaque, or whether it's the nature of the data that's out there, it doesn't matter. We as a society have decided that, misogyny and racism are not, they are not things that we want promoted. So it is undermining incrementally, and it's normalizing this these very antisocial behaviors.
And I think there is it's probably not like a random fact that the rise of AI is also concomitant to, like, like what we see with masculinism, thriving on social media. Also the lack of trust we have in our democratic institutions. So I guess there is a perfect negative storm around this.
Yeah, with the misinformation, the disinformation, which just again feeds anti-democratic. There is no surprise that the same actors that are pushing the far right, funding the far right throughout Europe, throughout the United States, the white supremacists in the US, there is no surprise that they are funded by the same people that are funding AI, data centers, and that are also funding continued fossil fuel use.
Yeah.
These are very socially corrosive factors, and for too long they have not been restricted. Right? They have limitless power through the amounts of money that they command, and that is not the way that we have decided democracy should run.
Yeah. In your latest book, Nomad Century, you addressed the topic of like mass migration related to climate change, and I was actually quite inspired by your optimistic take on it, right? Like there are solutions, and maybe this can be also an opportunity for humanity to step up as one, like, and maybe through some kind of UN body, we can, like, find solutions to deal with this mass migration. Like, if we apply this dose of optimism to how we can manage AI, how would it look like? Like, do you think like we can dream of some kind of UN body as well to deal, like how would it look like a good governance at worldwide level for AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the way forward. I mean, there are lots and lots of paths that we can go along in the future. We can go down this very dystopian path where it's quite amazing that all the science fiction books and movies that go along these very dystopian paths have almost been kind of co-opted by some of these Silicon Valley tech bros who have kind of missed the whole point of these films, which is don't do this. It's very bad. But I choose in my work to explore livable futures and a good Anthropocene, a good future. How do we achieve that? How do we make things better? How do we make a better world? And I think that comes from taking a step back and taking a planetary perspective, a whole species perspective on the issues that we have and on the solutions that we have. And in various ways, looking at that, not from the kind of like micro niche of parochial NIMBYism or whatever, but looking much more broadly and say, in the case of AI and in the case of social media generally, there has been this fight that hasn't been won or hasn't been fought openly about the landscape, about the online landscape. I mean, you can't go somewhere in the world. I mean, people do, but you can't legally go somewhere in the world and just fill it with toxic trash and just burn it and create huge pollution that goes everywhere. You can't do that on our terrestrial lived landscape, on our reality. That's an absolute disgrace. There's laws that are against that sort of thing. It creates wars because we've gone through as societies that fight about how we use land and how we respect the ownership of that land and the commons, the air that we breathe, the waters that we drink from, the trees that suck in the carbon dioxide, all of that. And we're having an ongoing battle about that. But the general understanding is you can't make a toxic mess out of everything. Whereas for the online landscape, that has been privatized, essentially. It started off as a global online commons, this wonderful idea, things like Wikipedia, Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web, this idea that it's this global commons and we can all enjoy it, it doesn't belong to anyone. And what's happened is it's become these kind of owned spaces because of who owns the software, who owns these enormous sites. And they have been poisoned by all sorts of misinformation, disinformation, hate groups, a toxic landscape, essentially, to many people, and that is poisoning that space. And we haven't had that discussion about, how do we deal with the online commons
Yeah,
at
this
all?
discussion feels like it's always happening 2 years after the fact, right? And we're always
Yeah.
running after a train that left the station like long ago, basically. And
Yeah,
there,
but I mean, these are essentially publishers, and we have rules on, you can't publish in Le Monde or in the Times. You can't publish a load of hateful, libelous nonsense about people. That would be, you'd be sued, right?
yeah,
It's illegal to do that. Whereas online, that is going on all the time. And, we need our laws and our because it's happening so fast, we need our statutes to come a lot faster and actually address some of these issues to make it a site that has equity, where everybody has a place. I mean, there are already built-in inequities to the online world. Most of it is English, some French and Spanish and Hindi or whatever. There are some other languages, but there is plenty of people that are completely disenfranchised because they're not part of that landscape. And how do we make it much more equal? These are the conversations that we need to have, because I think it's perfectly possible to create a much more beautiful world where AI is another tool that helps humanity to become its best self, to flourish.
yes. I mean, let's circle back to this, and maybe also mentioning the concept of Anthropocene that you quoted. It is something that is core to your first published book, which is basically, I think, if we try to define it, it's like the fact that human activities are now the primary force of climate, environmental, planetary changes, right? And as you described it, the Anthropocene is like based on the concept of extraction, right? Like we take all those resources, we extract them to our own benefit at full scale, full speed, and that becomes detrimental to the environment. And what's interesting is like going back to AI, this logic of extraction is now kind of applied to our own content, soul, like our own creative outputs as human. And it feels like it's almost like it's like an anthropophage version of Anthropocene, right? Like we are self-consuming ourselves. I I wonder where this force is coming from, like on a more philosophical level. Like is this innate? Is this shared by everyone? Like is it like kind of like part of the structure of the human ambition? Maybe a quest for our comfort that leads us to over assert our control over nature and know our very own nature? Or is it, you think, something just specifically related to a late stage capitalism? Like, I'm curious to know, are we fighting something political and specific with late stage capitalism, or are we fighting a force that is within us and that becomes ineluctable in some ways?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think what is innate in ourselves is this curiosity, right? This curiosity about the world. We are a curious ape. And part of our nature is our technological superiority. We are incredibly good at technological, cultural evolution, right? We have that, whereas other animals don't. Their technology is very, very limited to specific things. So what happens is our technologies, our culture progresses in various ways. We fuse these different cultures and it accelerates, and the numbers of people and that nexus, those interconnections between different people are what really propel the cultural evolution of any technology. So we see these great spurts of activity, that the communications revolution, like really the 20th century was this huge acceleration in human progress. And that was driven by population expansion, by people living in cities, and by that greater interconnectivity, which allows people to fuse different ideas together and really propel these different technologies. So that I do think is innate. This cannibalization of our cultural attributes, our books, our music, our creativity in all kinds of aspects, by a computer system which is, however its proponents say, is AI conscious? Of course it's not conscious, right? It is basically a fancy autocomplete. It is just scraping the data and just it's very, very good at this, but it basically makes plausible ends to sentences. And when you ask it a question for which there is enormous amounts of data, it is quite likely to come out with a correct answer. When you ask it a question for which there is very little data, it will quite likely come out with the wrong answer, because it's an autocomplete. It's not something that is genuinely thinking for itself. And it has been good enough to convince people, and the tech bros that are advocating for their products have been good enough to convince people that it is really thinking like us. And what is innate to us is we do like to anthropomorphize whatever. We anthropomorphize animals, but also technologies. We like to see, a friendly lighthouse blinking as a friend, as it's sending us a message. It's not. The AI is also not a friend or a foe. It's just a tool that was programmed by a person.
It is very symptomatic that AI, at least the way it's been released recently to the world and in billions of hands, is released in the shape of a chatbot, right? Like a conversational that answers the same way. But like I wonder if there is no like you mentioned social media and the current times, we talk a lot about attention economy, and like no, I feel like every entrepreneur, every startupper has to see its products like in millions of hands for it to be valid. And it's interesting. I think AI has been shipped in the world, like in this context of like if it's not used by millions, then it is not valid. And maybe there is something also about like we need millions of users computers to train those models and like to train the data.
Yeah, and that's the danger. Like what you were saying earlier about, is this late stage capitalism danger? And yes, it is. This is part of a very sick economic system, which says that it must produce profit for shareholders, and that is the measure of a success. Not it has to make life better for people, or it has to make it has to provide benefits other than financial benefits for shareholders.
Yeah.
And that is the sickness, and that is what we need to change, and how we need to change. The Anthropocene is about humans now being dominant. So we are dominant, but we are also conscious. We're the only species who can change direction. So we can go from extractive and purely extractive, which is a very recent phenomenon, right? Which takes us out of the organic, biological, self-healing part of the planet that all other species are part of this biosphere, where things are broken down on the same scale as as an animal's life, or as a tree's life. We've now taken things to an extractive level, so when they're broken down on a scale of millions of years, right? Which is not helpful to anything. And we can redesign that, and we're seeing that redesign happening with things like the circular economy, with much more conscious choices on materials, taking materials that will biodegrade or will degrade under very simple circumstances, or things that can be reused, or things that can easily be taken apart and repaired. And we're seeing that, but it, again, incredibly slow. And the problem with a lot of this AI and these devices is we are again being pushed to get the latest, because it has the latest model of AI on it. And it's a sort of this very, it's like a disease that we have to keep going. It's like when cigarettes are outlawed. Well, here we are. Here's some more products that you can have to cure you from not buying enough of our other products. It's this compulsion, and this isn't going to be solved by the marketplace. This is not going to be solved by the tech designers. This has to be solved collectively as part of our democratic process by the citizens that live in this environment and this society. Otherwise, it's not solved.
Gaia, I want to close this conversation looking a bit forward and going back to one of your book, like touching on the notion of transcendence. There is a core concept that you work in it, which is cumulative culture, right? And like the idea that our greatest advantage as humanity is not necessarily the knowledge like one owns, but our ability to transmit and build over this knowledge from generation to generation, so that the next one is slightly smarter than the previous one. And what's interesting is like this notion of cumulative culture is always kind of dependent on a human, a teacher, a community to transmit the culture. I feel like with AI, it's maybe the first time in history where we can break that, right? Like it's no longer like a human that can transmit knowledge, but the power of data and LLMs. I am curious to know, like, from your research, like do you buy this, and like what are the implications of that, like for the generations to come with the rise of AI?
So no, absolutely not. No, Vinny. I don't, because all the AI is doing is taking our collective community of culture that has existed for, millions of years. Well, not millions, sorry. Hundreds of thousands of years, right? We have been on this journey. We have shared our ideas, our knowledge. We, since we invented writing, but even before that, we were, Homer's works were not written down. They were passed from generation to generation. A millennia later, here we are still quoting Homer. And that's the same for all of our cultural knowledge. It is collected, it's in libraries, it's shared among old women, it's shared among communities, it's sung across borders. It is our collective knowledge, and it is a collective brilliance that has made us who we are. It's not that we are individually some very smart thing. It is entirely based on this data, this history, and it's not just data, but that's what the AI takes, and that's the difference. So the AI is essentially a big library of stuff, but what it's doing is it's mangling that creativity. It's making a mess of it. So whereas now, or whereas 5 years ago, you could go through the archives of scientific journals and have a look at articles and look at conclusions and practices and what scientists have published about various things and be sure that that was real. Now, the AI is producing hallucinated bullshit articles, right? So we can't tell anymore what's real and what isn't. And that breaks down trust in our own collective knowledge, our own culture. It means that we are losing something so precious about what it means to be human, and that is our collective culture. And that is what worries me, and why we really, really must build greater trust in our institutions and in ourselves to do something about this, to rein in the pernicious behaviors of these AI code writers.
I see we're running out of time, but I really enjoyed this conversation so much. I hope the audience will as well. And I think it boils down to when it comes to technology, we should always ask the questions of who shapes them, what impact it does have, and for which consequences. So thank you so much for exploring this theme with us.
Oh, it's huge pleasure, Vianney.
Okay, we're gonna try something for this first episode of TalkBack with a segment called Tech Support. And Gaia, I'm gonna ask you to tell me a tech habit of your own that you think could use some improvements.
Oh my God. There are so many. Well, probably doom scrolling, especially before bed, and just like sitting endlessly scrolling on my phone is really bad. I should be much more present, especially with my children, read books more. I think we all could do that, but I'm very bad.
It's hard to be immune for sure. Gaia, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I hope our audience will as well. I think we demonstrated through this conversation that when it comes to technology, the question of what we build, for whom, and what it costs, it's always worth asking, even, and I would say especially when the answers are not obvious. So thank you so much for joining this first episode of TalkBack, Gaia.
Oh, thank you, Vinny. It's been a huge pleasure. And these questions are, they're philosophical questions that get us, this tech is forcing us to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be human? So thanks for asking these questions.